It's Wednesday, the 17th of May, 2023. Welcome to the Fast Five by Fear and Greed, where we give you the top 5 business stories you need to know in just 5 minutes. I'm Michael Thompson, and good morning, Sean Aylmer.
Good morning, Michael.
Sean, 5 stories in 5 minutes. Let's jump straight into story number 1. This is interesting, perhaps a little bit worrying. The Reserve Bank has made it clear it will lift interest rates again if inflation remains elevated, calling out productivity as the key to pushing prices lower.
The minutes to the board meeting of 2 weeks ago, when it announced a surprise 25 basis point hike, say that further increases in interest rates may still be required, depending on how the economy and inflation evolve. While the board of the central bank considered leaving the cash rate on hold at the beginning of the month, the pick-up in services inflation and weak productivity growth pushed the board into a rate hike in what it described as a finely balanced decision. The bank also said that inflation is forecast to return to the top of the 2 to 3% band by mid-2025 based on productivity returning to its what must be called a modest pre-pandemic pace.
Sean, we hear a lot about productivity and we're hearing more about it now. We obviously kind of know what the word generally means, but in this sense, in the economic sense, what is it? Why are we hearing so much about it?
Well, specifically, labour productivity is the level of output per hour worked. Rising productivity means getting more output for each hour of input. Labour productivity is the same today as it was 3 years ago during the pandemic. In the final quarter of last year, it actually went backwards. That's not good. It was much higher in March last year, for example. Overall, productivity growth in an economy is the holy grail. It means there's more output for every unit of input. So there's more to go around. That keeps the cap on prices. It's how people get a rise in real wages. It's how standards of living in an economic sense rise. The reason productivity isn't so good at the moment, according to the Reserve Bank, probably something to do with COVID-19 hangover, also might have something to do with strong growth in employment in government-funded services, where achieving productivity increases is often difficult, Michael.
On to story number 2 now, Sean. Australians in their early 30s and renters are feeling the most pressure from the cost of living, according to analysis of the spending patterns of 7 million people. That is a lot of people.
It is a very large data set. The report by CommBank IQ uses payments data to determine spending behaviour in response to inflation, interest rates and rent increases. 30 to 34-year-olds and renters are feeling the most pressure. The Cost of Living Insights report turns up some surprising observations. Spending on essential items is barely keeping up with inflation, but spending on discretionary stuff, travel, for example, is still surging. So people are happy to cut back on the necessities of life to have money for the good stuff. People are catching up on what they missed out on during the pandemic. In terms of actual spending, Australians aged 25 to 29 show the largest reduction, while spending increases as people get older. Some great bits of information in the research. Spending on petrol is down 5%, for example, but on public transport and ride sharing is up 9%. Down on furniture and apparel, no surprise, up for travel and accommodation.
All right, story number 3. Australian banks will use a real-time reporting tool to stop scam payments as part of a greater effort to safeguard customers and also to improve their ability to recover stolen funds.
The Banking Fraud Reporting Exchange will enable the freezing of the banking accounts of scammers soon after payments are reported as fraudulent. That's according to the Australian Banking Association. The platform has been built by the banks. It will be world leading, according to Anna Bligh, who's the boss of the Australian Banking Association. Of course, it comes as the Albanese government is working on a mandatory multi-industry best practice code, which will affect banks and telcos, social media platforms. The goal is to set high standards and obligations about customers' data security. Big business scams in Australia. Losses last year were about $3 billion.
Wow, that is big. Story number 4, Federal Resources Minister Madeleine King has backed carbon capture and storage as the best way for the resources industry to reach net zero.
It's probably the only way for it to happen in a reasonable time frame. Carbon capture and storage involves capturing, transporting and storing greenhouse gas emissions by injecting them back into the ground. The government's encouraging it by removing regulatory barriers, but they're not really spending any money on it. Other countries, notably the US, is making billions of dollars of investments into carbon capture and storage projects. The challenge for Australia, of course, is we're a resource-based nation. That's how we make a lot of our income. We need the ability to capture carbon and store it. But there's no new funding for it, and last year the government actually reduced money for carbon capture storage by $250 million. All
right, last one. Story number 5. Artificial intelligence data services company Appen, Sean, hasn't had a particularly good time of it. Its share price has gone from more than $40 less than 3 years ago to around $2.30. Now, though, it wants to reinvent itself, particularly in the AI sector.
That's right. It went to the market yesterday to raise $60 million to fund a cost-cutting program, boost its balance sheet and diversify revenues. That last part is what I find fascinating. So last week, the company reported a loss of $18 million for the first 4 months of the year. Not so good. It basically needs a more diverse roster of clients. Yep, it's got Google, Apple, Microsoft, Meta, and Amazon, but it wants to go into the world of generative AI. It's a whole new field for Appen. Appen essentially provides people, real people, to provide human feedback for developers and adopters. They've been doing that for Google. They've been doing that for Microsoft. So in the AI world, Appen can provide feedback on whether an artificial intelligence model is actually providing the right answers, relevant answers, non-toxic responses, that type of thing. Kind of want to be the human part of AI. Fascinating.
That is fascinating. That's a really interesting story and a great one to finish on. It's the top 5 business stories in 5 minutes. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you, Michael.
It's Wednesday, the 17th of May, 2023. Remember to hit follow on the podcast. If 5 minutes isn't enough, you can find our longer daily show called Fear and Greed, wherever you listen to podcasts. And also today, being Wednesday, there's a new episode of our sister podcast, How Do They Afford That, out. It is all about credit scores, how you actually find out what your credit rating is, why you need to know what it is, and what to do if it's probably not quite as good as you'd like it to be. I'm Michael Thompson, and that was the Fast 5 by Fear and Greed. Have a great day.